Hello, welcome to Captain Dorja's Armory. This is Captain Dorja. We are going to be doing another World of Tanks advice. This World of Tanks advice, we're going to talk about two things. This is going to be tank part nomenclature and general rules of weak spots. So, we're going to jump straight into it. This is my Tiger 2, and I picked the Tiger 2 to talk about because it exhibits a lot of these things. Tiger 2 is a great tank. I really like it a lot. Enough that I rebought it after having completed the entire German heavy line. So yeah, Tiger 2, let's jump onto it. So obviously, I know everyone knows this, but turret right here at the top and hull at the bottom. That's kind of 101 right out of the way. Got that taken care of. Good. So we're going to talk about some things on the tank's turret. We're going to talk about those first. First of all, this right here at the very front of the turret, that is what is known as the turret face. So the flat plate at the front of the turret, that is the turret face. Not all tanks really have a turret face per se. A lot of the Russian tanks have very flat turrets to maintain a very low profile. So some of them don't really have very much of a turret face. Like the IS-3, it doesn't really have much of a turret face. It's kind of got one right here, but it's very small. Pretty much all American tanks, pretty much all German tanks, a lot of the British tanks have pretty prominent turret faces. And the turret face, in general, is a bad place to shoot. Now, the reason why the turret face is usually a bad place to shoot is because it tends to have the thickest armor on the tank is on the turret face. And that makes sense because real tanks, a lot of what they do, a lot of the time real tanks will be in a covered position where most of the hull is concealed and the turret is the only thing exposed. That's called going hull down, and it's one of the specialties of American tanks in this game is they're very good at going hull down because they have very large turrets with a lot of armor and they're able to depress their gun a lot, which means they're able to aim down really far. So the turret face tends to be very well armored. Now, on some tanks, the turret face also tends to be very flat. Probably the best example of that is the E100. The E100 has a massive turret face, and it is very, 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 very flat. Some other tanks that are notable for having a very flat turret face are low-tier British tanks. This is a Cromwell, but the turret on the Cromwell is very similar to the turret on the Churchill tanks. In the Churchill tanks, the front of the turret is just a flat turret face with really nothing protecting the gun. So on tanks like that, where you have a very flat turret face, even though it might be the thickest armor on the tank, because it's flat, a lot of the time that is actually a good place to shoot at if there are no other weak spots showing. So we're going to look back at the Tiger 2. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at the gun mantlet. The Tiger 2 doesn't have a very prominent gun mantlet. It's kind of small. But this plug right here at the base of the gun and this little tube kind of sticking out at the top, that is the gun mantlet. Now, the gun mantlet is also called the gun mantle. So mantle and mantlet are both acceptable words for this. Usually I go with mantlet. But if someone says gun mantle, it means the same thing, and it is a correct term. Now, the gun mantlet is basically, as a general rule, shooting a tank in the gun mantlet is like the worst possible place you can fire, because the gun mantlet is about the only place on a tank that is usually thicker armor than even the turret face. And also, the way the game mechanics work, it makes penetrating the gun mantlet very difficult. And in a nutshell, we can explain that pretty simply. The gun mantlet is basically it's extra armor on top of the turret face. So I got a 185 millimeter turret face, and say this gun mantlet is an extra 25 millimeters thick. That means that I'm now trying to shoot through not just 185 millimeter armor, I'm trying to shoot through 185 millimeter plus 25 millimeter armor. And gun mantlets tend to be round or sloped in some way. Like a E100 mantlet, it's rounded. E75 mantlet, it's a cone shape. lots of German tank destroyers, they have a mantlet like this. That's called a Saukopf mantlet. Those gun mantlets tend to be, there's a lot of angles in them, so it increases the chance of a ricochet. Then, assuming you can penetrate the gun mantlet's armor and the turret face armor underneath it, the gun itself has a hitbox that is located at the base of the gun, basically in the gun mantlet. So the gun hitbox has more armor on it and it has hit points. So in order to, if you fired like straight through here into the turret of this tank, in order to penetrate, you have to penetrate the gun mantlet, and you have to penetrate the turret face, then you have to penetrate the gun hitbox. And if your shell is able to go through all of that and keep going and hit something else in the turret, you'll do HP damage. But each time it has to go through a different part of the tank, it gives it the, quote, spaced armor effect, which we'll talk about in a different World of Tanks advice. But basically, shooting at spaced armor is bad. So basically, never shoot at a tank's gun mantlet. It's just a waste of time. Next thing on the turret, Commander's Hatch. This hatch right here. The Commander's Hatch on tanks is also known as the Commander's Cupola or the Commander's Cupola, depending on how you like to pronounce it. But a lot of people just call it the Commander's Hatch. Now, some Commander's Hatches are very small, like this one. This one's pretty small. Some are even smaller. This one's smaller than that. But basically, Commander's Hatches are almost always weak points. So, if you can't frontally penetrate any of the armor on an E-75, but you might be able to penetrate his Commander's Hatch. The British tank destroyers have very prominent Commander's Hatches. That's more of a cupola than a hatch. But anyway, those are, really good places to fire at. The T-110E5 has a very prominent Commander's Hatch. It's not very big on the M103, but the M103, the T-29, and the T-34 all have a pretty big Commander's Hatch. And if no other weak points are showing, that Commander's Hatch is a good target. It is a weak point. In general, every Commander's Hatch in the game is a weak point. Another big weak point that we're going to look at is any kind of machine gun turret. This is really more of a machine gun turret than a hatch. This is definitely a weak point on the KV-5. This machine gun turret, known as the R2-D2, definitely a weak point. Machine gun turrets are pretty much almost always weak points on tanks. About the only situation where that's not true is the machine gun turret on the T-110E3 is actually really well armored. I've bounced high explosive anti-tank rounds from Jagdpanzer E100s with that. So that alleged weak spot, it's not actually very weak. And if we take a quick look, heat rounds on the Jagdpanzer E100 have an average of 420 penetration. And I've bounced 3 of them in a row in a single match with that machine gun turret. So not necessarily a good target. Now, that pretty much covers everything on the turret that I want to mention, except for one thing. So we're going to come back to this bad boy. This is the T-29. So we have the turret face right here, and on top of that we have the gun mantlet. And the armor on the front of this turret is extremely thick. It's 279 millimeters thick, virtually impenetrable. But right here, you have this part. This is commonly referred to as the turret cheek, which makes sense because it's sort of on the front, but it's sort of on the side. And so, here's the face, and then on the outside of the face you have the cheeks. That makes sense. That's a sensible term. The turret cheeks on some tanks with thick turret armor can be weak spots if you have a strong enough gun. So things like the T-29 and the T-34, if you have a powerful enough gun, you can get through the turret cheek. If you've got an angle kind of like this at an M103, you might be able to get through his turret cheek. The Conqueror has really weak turret cheek armor. The KV-5 has big turret cheeks, and the armor on those is weak. So, the turret cheeks. If you can't get a better weak point, a lot of the time, a tank with a turret cheek, the cheek is usually not as thick. Now, things like a Tiger II, they don't really have turret cheeks, and if you shoot at the front and you hit this part right here, it's almost certainly going to bounce. So don't waste your time. And we're going to move on to the hull. I'm going to move on to the hull real quick. Now this right here is the main armored portion of the tank's hull. This big metal plate right here, this is called the glasic plate, and people will refer to this glasic plate in a number of ways. When people talk about it, they'll either call it the glasic plate, they'll call it the upper plate, or they'll call it the front plate. And all of that really makes sense because it's a big plate and it's on the front. So, calling it the front plate makes sense. And calling it the upper plate makes sense as well because, we've got a plate here, and we've got a plate here, and this one is on top. So this one is the upper plate. The upper plate of most tanks is a bad place to shoot. It generally isn't as thick as the turret face, but it's usually the second thickest armor on a tank after the turret face. Some tanks are notorious for having very weak upper plates, like the American heavies. Most of them have very weak upper plates. The T-29, the T-34, the T-32, they don't have very good upper plates. The high-tier American tanks, the Tier 9 and Tier 10s, they have quite a strong upper plate, so you don't want to shoot the upper plate on high-tier American tanks. You don't want to shoot the upper plate on German tanks. German tanks have a lot of armor concentrated on their upper plate, and it's usually very sloped. So the upper plate is usually a bad place to aim. Kind of a side note on all this is there's multiple types of upper plates. The Russians fairly commonly have one that's known as a pike nose. And the pike nose is an upper plate that is pre-angled to make penetration more difficult. And the IS-7 is a really, really good example. It's got a very prominent pike nose, very strong upper plate. Not generally a good idea to try and penetrate the IS-7's upper plate unless you have a very, very powerful gun and a favorable firing angle. Another type of upper plate that's pretty common, it can be found on Russian tanks, it can be found on British tanks, and it can be found on a lot of earlier German tanks, is what's known as a vertically stepped plate. And a vertically stepped plate like this, it's kind of shaped like stairs. It's got a sort of flat spot, and by flat I mean horizontally flat. This is fairly horizontally flat. Then it's got a much more vertical step, and then you have the flat part on the top. So this is what's called a vertically stepped plate. When you fire at a vertically stepped plate, you want to make sure you're not hitting this part, because this is the part that's the strongest armor, because it's got the most slope. If you fire here and you have enough penetration, you should be alright. And obviously, you have this part right here. So on tanks with a vertically stepped plate, basically you don't want to shoot at the middle. You want to either shoot at the top strip or the bottom strip. The KV-3 is a really good example. The IS sort of has a vertically stepped plate. The KV-1S has a vertically stepped plate. Some other tanks that are not Russians that have vertically stepped plates. German low-tier tanks, the 3601, it's got a vertically stepped plate. The Tiger has a vertically stepped plate. British tanks like the Cromwell has a vertically stepped plate. The Comet has a vertically stepped plate. The Churchill models and the Black Prince, they have vertically stepped plates. It's a fairly common thing from most of the pre-war and early war designs. So that kind of covers the upper plate. A couple of things on tanks' upper plates that can be good places to shoot. When you see a tank like a Tiger II and you have to fire at its upper plate, machine gun ports, those are weak points, and they really are weak points in the actual armor too. And historically, there were instances I can think of in the Mauritania counterattack that the Germans mounted against the Americans. I can think of a time when a bunch of, I think, Panthers, maybe Panzer IVs, I don't remember, they were attacking an American roadblock, and they were doing it in the mist. Nobody could really see anything. And the American roadblock, for anti-tank weapons, they had two towed 57mm guns. And simply put, those towed AT guns, they didn't have the penetration to go through the front armor of the German tanks. And they couldn't even see the German tanks. All they could see was the muzzle flash of the German bow gunners. because the Germans knew there was a roadblock up there somewhere, so they were trying to suppress it with their bow guns. And the AT gunners actually fired at that muzzle flash, and more than one occasion in this one isolated incident were able to penetrate otherwise impenetrable frontal armor for that gun and knock out multiple German tanks. Normally, they wouldn't have been able to penetrate anywhere on the front of the tank, but they were able to hit the machine gun ball and knock the tanks out. And that holds true in World of Tanks as well. If a tank's got a machine gun ball, like on the Tiger II, or on the 4502P, or on the 3601, those are weak points and you can fire at them. And that is why most of the higher tier tanks, they don't have machine gun ports on their front armor. See, no machine gun. No machine gun. If you look at high tier Russian tanks like IS-8 or IS-7, no machine gun ports. Another weak spot are if you have a driver's viewport or if you have a driver's hatch. Those tend to be weak points. Let's look for something with a prominent driver's hatch. Where's my IS-6? The IS-6, it's got a driver's hatch on it. That is weaker armor than all the rest of this front plate. So if you have to fire at the front plate of a tank where you normally are going to have a hard time penetrating it, go for a machine gun port or a driver's hatch or a driver's viewport. On some tanks where they have a sort of hexagonal front, like the IS-6 and the IS-4, those are the two best examples I can think of. You have sort of side plates right here. These are often referred to as the cheeks of the hull. So these are the tank's hull cheeks. Basically, from frontally, you don't want to shoot here, you don't want to shoot here, because there's more angling, more likely to bounce. But if you catch an IS-6 or an IS-4 at an angle like this, instead of firing here, if you can shoot into this cheek, a lot of the time that'll be more of a weak point, just because of the relative angling of the armor. It'll be easier to penetrate. So that's kind of that on hull cheeks. Now we're going to come on to the sort of the Mac Daddy of all tank weak points. This is the thing that applies to basically every single tank in World of Tanks ever. The lower plate. The lower plate is the bane of the existence of German tank drivers, because if you look at virtually all German tanks, all the way up through, a commonality is they have big lower plates. Not only are they big lower plates, but they are big, flat lower plates. So, I mean, just look at all of these tanks. Every single one of these has got a big lower plate. These lower plates are poorly armored. They are not intended to be shot. So, because they're not intended to be shot, because they're poorly armored, they're a great place to shoot at. And that holds true to almost every single tank in the game. Obviously, tanks have varying armor on their lower plates. So, like a T-110E5, the lower plate of a T-110E5 is more difficult to penetrate than the lower plate of an M103. But, the E5 is also going to be more difficult to penetrate than the lower plate of an E100. The E100's lower plate is almost a joke. It's so easy to penetrate. And the way that tank drivers will get around their very, very weak lower plates is to try and cover it up. But if you can't cover it up, you have to angle the tank. And in some tanks, the only way to angle your lower plate enough to deflect a shot means that you give so much of your side that nobody even bothers aiming at your lower plate. They just penetrate your side. So the lower plate is a great place to shoot at on almost all tanks. Sometimes it is very, very small, like French tank destroyers have a very small lower plate. So on stuff like an AMX 50 Foch or on an ACMLE 1948, which is what we're looking at right here, the lower plate is so tiny you're going to have a really hard time hitting it. Much better place to aim are these, machine gun turrets like I said before, machine gun turrets are a go-to. If you see a tank with a machine gun turret and you know you have a hard time penetrating his regular armor, fire it as machine gun turrets, you'll probably penetrate. Also, rangefinders like this are good weak points. It is worth noting, however, that the notorious turret ears on the T-29's rangefinder, those are no hitbox, so don't shoot at them. You won't ever do any damage. But in general, on just about everything else, rangefinders are also a good weak point. So, we've talked about tanks' front plates, we've talked about their lower plates, we've talked about their turrets. Now we're going to talk about a couple of things from the side. Now, most tank side armor is pretty weak, so it's pretty easy to penetrate. But the biggest thing is the tracks. Tank tracks act as spaced armor in a lot of times. A skilled player can angle his tank so that his tracks will eat a lot of damage, which can be very frustrating if you're the guy shooting at him. But it also means they're going to get their tracks blown off a lot, which can be really good. If you want to blow a tank's tracks off, there's two ways to do it. You can shoot straight on into the front of the track, like right here, or if you're from the side, there's two places to aim at if you really want to damage tracks. The wheels at the ends of the tracks. If you hit those, it's almost guaranteed detracking. Now, those are called, depending on their function, either the idler or the sprocket, and that's different on every tank. So basically, we're not going to worry about whether or not this is technically the sprocket or this is technically the idler. We're just going to say that the idlers and sprockets are good targets to detrack. The other thing is if you fire a detracking shot from the front like this, you're just going to blow the track off. But if you fire a detracking shot at like a 45-degree angle through the sprocket or through the idler, you'll usually deal damage and detrack the guy. So that can be really, really good. Now, if you want to shoot into the side of a tank without doing track damage, aim at the hull above the track. Some tanks, like this 3601, they have a lot of hull space above their track. The Tiger II, it's got a lot of hull space above the track. But not all tanks really have that. Like if we go to the IS series, they're notorious for this. There's not a lot of hull space above the track, and it's spaced armor all the way into here. This is basically a void of air behind this light armor plate. And then there's the main armor plate in here. And what that's designed to do is it means that the shell has to penetrate twice. And it means if you fire a high explosive anti-tank shell, all the energy is wasted getting through this light plate, and then it can't get through this heavier one. So against IS series tanks, when you get them side on, you're probably better off just shooting at the tracks. You might detrack the guy instead of dealing damage, but you have an odds-honest chance of doing the same, hit for no damage on his side hull. But if you blow his tracks off in the process, at least you'll get assistance damage for any damage done by anybody else. Basically, when you get an IS tank in the side, just try to get it in the back, too, because it's so much easier to deal damage. That's pretty much everything that I want to say about tank weaknesses and general tank nomenclature. I just thought of one other thing super quick. Basically on every tank in the game except the Russian IS series, if you get them in the side or back of the turret, definitely shoot there because you potential to deal a lot of critical damage. The only real exception I would say to that is a lot of the Russian IS tanks, they have really flat, really sloped turrets, so they can still bounce shells off them, even off the back. And the last kind of exception is the T-34 Tier 8 American Heavy. The back of the turret is 200 millimeters thick, so not a good target. Don't shoot at the back of the T-34's turret. Anyway, I hope that was. I hope you found that helpful, and I hope that knowing the names of these tank parts is going to be helpful, because this way, if you ask somebody, "Hey, where's a good place to shoot at a T-28 prototype?" If they tell you, "Shoot it on the turret face to the side of the mantlet," that means, you'll know now that means here's the mantlet, here's the turret face. Oh, he wants me to shoot it right here. Or, Shoot at the machine gun port. Oh, okay, he wants me to shoot right here. Or shoot at the lower plate. Well, that's going to be hard. The lower plate's very small. So I hope that tank nomenclature and general principles of weak points was valuable, and I hope you found it helpful and applicable. I know that was kind of a long video and kind of a dry video, so I apologize. Anyway, guys, until next time, this is Captain Dorja, and just remember, you can never have enough big guns.